Philip Goff has recently announced his conversion to Christianity. Now, before anybody gets too excited or too upset, it's worth noting that he hasn't embraced a fully historic or orthodox version of Christianity.
I've ended up in this weird position of being a kind of mildly heretical Christian, as we'll get into.
But he does see himself as coming to a place of faith in Christ. Is Philip Goff really a Christian? Well, hang on to the end. I will weigh in on that issue, as well as I want to tell you about a movie project that I think you'll want to check out. Philip Goff is a well-known UK-based philosopher. He's the author of a few books now. His most popular book is called Galileo's Error. It's probably one of the more successful books in academic philosophy in recent years. It's earned him appearances on Joe Rogan, Russell Brand, and a number of other big podcast shows. Much of his work focuses in on understanding consciousness, and he defends a view called panpsychism. To understand panpsychism, we kind of have to see how much trouble consciousness is for the philosophical materialist, the view that says fundamental reality really boils down to just matter and energy. Panpsychism is this sort of wild view that says the fundamental particles of reality are themselves to some degree conscious. Consciousness is sort of baked into the universe in its most fundamental sense. Now, what I like about panpsychism is that it questions what is for some an unquestionable commitment to philosophical materialism. Here's Philip Goff attempting to talk Joe Rogan out of a philosophical materialist understanding of the spiciness of curry.
But it's not really true, because there's a chemical reaction. We know what the ingredients are in the curry that causes it to have a spicy reaction to the human being that's taking it in. It's a very distinct, very definable chemical reaction.
Yeah, so look, there's definitely a lot we can do mathematically with the tools of mathematical science. Yeah, you can capture the chemical composition of the curry. You can capture the changes it makes in your brain.
Right.
But then at some point, the resulting brain activity goes along with the sensation of spiciness.
Well, you recognize
that's where the miracle happens.
All right, Philip Goff has clearly been on a kind of religious journey. In fact, it was just a few years ago he identified as an atheist and said that Christianity is false. He was on the Unbelievable show with Justin Brierley, and I think Justin might have been under the impression that Philip Goff was a little closer to Christianity than he actually was.
You are someone who goes to church, finds a great meaning in the practice of Christian ritual, but are as yet uncommitted to a lot of the doctrinal elements of that.
I'm probably stronger than that. I mean, I positively believe it's false.
Okay, fair enough. All right.
At least, I'm definitely an atheist about God as traditionally conceived because of the problem of evil, which I think is one of the most compelling philosophical arguments there is. But, I think, I do believe that there is a moral and a spiritual aspect to reality, and that's as real as what we know about reality scientifically. And I guess I see the purposes of religion as to connect individuals and community up to that moral and spiritual aspect.
So just a few years ago, he was saying that he positively believed that Christianity was false and that he was an atheist, at least about God as traditionally conceived. Now, he still doesn't believe that God exists as traditionally conceived, but I suspect that he wouldn't identify as an atheist today. And he's converted to a non-standard, or what we might call a heterodox version of Christianity. So he's definitely changed his mind on a few things. Here's the story of what happened.
I think this started 6 years ago, actually, when I was asked to teach philosophy of religion. As you said, I've normally done philosophy of mind before. So this is when I first came to Durham University in the UK, which is my current university. And so they asked me to teach a fairly standard philosophy of religion course. You teach the arguments against God, you teach the arguments for God, then the students make up their mind which they find more compelling and write their essay. Right, so I started with the classic argument, against the existence of God, the challenge of reconciling a loving, all-powerful God with the terrible suffering we find in the world. And I thought to myself, yeah, very convincing, definitely no God, job done. But then it came to the arguments for the existence of God, and I found myself thinking, actually, these are quite compelling as well. Particularly the argument from the fine-tuning of physics for life, this discovery of recent decades that many of the numbers in physics are against incredible odds, just right for the possibility of life. So I was finding both sides compelling. And this left me with quite some difficulty, right? Because I kind of live out my philosophy. These aren't abstract intellectual puzzles for me. If I don't know what I think on some philosophical matter, I literally can't sleep, you know? Yeah. So I was really wrestling with this for quite some time.
I think that everybody should admit that the fine-tuning arguments at least point to God, or something God-ish, as he puts it. The fine-tuning is the idea that the fundamental cosmic constants and initial conditions of the universe had to be dialed in with an incomprehensible precision. For example, the gravitational constant, if that was varied by just 1 part in 10 to the 60th, or if the cosmological constant was changed by 1 part in 10 to the 120th, these variations would result in a life-prohibiting universe. I just think we can't fully appreciate how big these numbers are when we're dealing with a 1 with, say, 60 or more zeros after it. There's about a dozen of these initial conditions and constants that have to be dialed in with this incomprehensible precision, and they have to be dialed in from the very first moment. So the universe has to be preloaded this way from the very first instant, or there's no life in the universe. This is what you would expect to see if there was a designing mind, and this is absolutely what you wouldn't expect to see if there wasn't a designing mind. But at the same time, I think everyone should admit that the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, in a way points away from God. It at least creates tension in believing in God. I think we can address the problem of evil, but I don't think it's this knockdown, drag-out solution that just makes it all go away. So here we go, right? So when we consider the brutality and just the unthinkable horrors that go on in the world, I mean, like every day, all throughout the day, somewhere in the world, terrible, terrible things are happening and suffering is happening. In no particular order, right? We have things like death and disease and drowning and rape and murder and assault and abuse and car accidents and botched surgeries and hurricanes and floods and mudslides and fires and fatal childhood diseases, really just to mention a few. And I can just understand when someone is focused in on these sorts of things, why it pulls them away from the belief in God. So it's this twin line of thinking that leads Philip Goff to what he calls a eureka moment.
And at some point, I just had a real eureka moment. I'd been assuming these arguments pushed in opposite directions, so you had to work out which you agreed with. But actually, I don't think they do. You know, the classic argument against God is arguing against a very particular form of God, what we call the omni-God, all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good. But the arguments for God, or at least the fine-tuning argument for God, is arguing for something much more generic, something God-ish, just some kind of purpose or goal-directedness in the early universe. So I realized if you go for something God-ish, but you don't go for the omni-God, then you can sort of have your cake and eat it. And then this eventually turned into the book I published last year, modestly titled Why, the Purpose of the Universe. And that was essentially saying, look, we've had this never-ending debate between traditional atheists and traditional theists, but they both have something right, they both have something wrong, and there's a middle ground option we can explore here. So I mean, like, one way of putting the challenge of the problem of evil is, why would a good God who can do anything choose to create life through the gruesome, torturous process of evolution by natural selection, right? But if God is not all-powerful, maybe God didn't have much choice, right? Maybe the only way God can create intelligent life is by creating a world, a universe with the right physics that will eventually evolve intelligent life. And God's like, I know it's going to be messy. I'm sorry. I wish it could be another way, but it's that or nothing.
Yeah.
So I think this hypothesis can explain the fine-tuning in terms of God's purposes, but can also explain the suffering in terms of God's limitations. So both sides, traditional atheism, traditional theism, both have something they can't explain. I really think this hypothesis can explain all the data, so I really think it's where the evidence is pointing.
So rather than seeing these as sort of offsetting, Goff sees these as leading to a kind of middle way where he embraces both as successful arguments. So you put these two arguments together, and Goff thinks that God exists, but it's a God of limited power. Now, it may sound like quite a concession to say that God has limited power, and it is quite a concession, but it really all depends how we understand this. To be clear, I defend the view of God that says he is omnipotent, but no one that I know would define omnipotence the way Goff does, as being able to do anything. There are things that God cannot do, and it's a good thing he can't. Now, given my theological commitments and my theological temperament, I always want to be very cautious whenever I say the phrase, God cannot X. However, I think as we'll see, there are clearly things that God cannot do. For example, God can't make it such that he no longer exists. God can't annihilate himself. God can't create something greater than himself. So as it turns out, the answer to the age-old question is no. God can't create a rock so large that he cannot lift it. But also think about this, that God can't do evil or do anything that's morally imperfect. The Bible is actually really clear about this. So Titus 1:2 says that God cannot lie. Hebrews 6:18 says that it's impossible for God to lie. So the thought is that God is so perfect that he can't suffer any moral imperfection. It's also often thought that God can't do the genuinely illogical. He can't create a square circle, create a married bachelor. He can't cause 2 + 3 to equal 4. And he can't causally determine an action that is also at the same time libertarianly free. These would all be logical contradictions. So theologians often define omnipotence as God's being able to do things that are logically possible and consistent with his character. So that's kind of a concession too, but does that mean we have a limited God? Well, no, not really. I mean, if he's limited by perfection, and that's a pretty good limit to have. But this is not limited in the sense of being diminished in some aspect. That's probably more what Goff has in mind, I think. Right? But probably even like the limited, unlimited is not the best way to put it. I think a much better term that I would like is to talk about God's being maximal or perfect or something to that effect. So on this more standard view, God is not diminished in his power, even though he can't do evil, he can't lie, he can't go against his nature, and he can't simply create free creatures who never go wrong. So Goff seems to be saying that there are things that are logically possible and perfectly consistent with God's character that God just can't do. He might want to do those things, but he just has the inability or is in a way helpless to do those things. He says this in his essay. He says, God would have liked to make intelligent life in an instant, or by breathing into the dust as we see depicted in Genesis. But the only way God was able to create life was by bringing into existence a universe with the right physics that would eventually evolve intelligent life. God made the best universe that God could. Now, I see why he lands here, but I'm not sure I see why this rather large concession is necessary. For one, I'm not at all sure why God would have the ability to bring about a universe from nothing finely tuned for human existence, but can't, for some reason, bring about a tree or a squirrel, or a human. And furthermore, I think that rather than saying that God lacks the ability to prevent evil, I find it far more satisfying to think that God allows evil but he allows evil for good and justifying reasons consistent with his loving character. On my view, God has the power to destroy evil. He could do that, but he doesn't, because that would mean that he destroys you and me in a sense. Rather, he has good and justifying reasons for allowing evil that have to do with a plan for humanity. Forced love is not love. Forced worship is not worship. And this really, I think, accounts for the messiness of creation, right? But the possibility of genuine relationship. And Goff might be right that if we only had the fine-tuning argument, then we would only have reason to believe in something God-ish. But on my view, we don't only have the fine-tuning argument. I think there's a wide array of good arguments to believe in a fuller picture of who God is. Some arguments are, of course, better than others, but I think the cumulative effect, the cumulative force of all these arguments give us something like the maximally perfect God. But I'll confess that I'm completely taken with the ontological argument for God's existence, where you really start with God as the greatest conceivable being and argue from there. To me, this is the sort of atomic bomb of theistic arguments, because you land on a God that can't not exist. But I suspect that Goff isn't a fan of the argument already, since he's already rejecting God as the greatest conceivable being, in that he embraces God of limited power. But here's the point, and this is a big payoff. If we have reason to believe that God, the maximally perfect being, exists, then we can know this, that God has good and justifying reasons for allowing evil, pain, and suffering, even if we don't know what those reasons are. That is, if we rationally believe in an all-good and all-powerful God, then we thereby and in turn have reason to believe that God allows evil, pain, and suffering for good reasons. So I think that's the difference. Do we believe that God is limited and just has the inability to stop evil, pain, and suffering? Or is God refraining for good and justified reasons? I find the latter much more satisfying. Now, maybe Goff would say that God could not have justified reasons for the kind of suffering that we see in the world. But here's where I think we may already be assuming a limited God. Perhaps we need to go in the other direction and posit a much bigger God. It's important that we see the disparity between God and us. I mean, talk about limited, right? We are very, very, very limited. And so why couldn't God have reasons that just for us, we can't comprehend? We are like toddlers trying to understand the decisions of our parents. Or it's probably worse than that. It's probably more like Isaiah 40 that pictures us as grasshoppers trying to understand the heavens. It seems entirely plausible to me that God, in his bigness, could have justification for allowing evil, pain, and suffering, even the horrors that we see, and my puny mind just can't even come close to comprehending it. At the very least, I think we should be leery about making our ability to understand or comprehend the test for what God is able to do. Now, just to be clear, this is not blind faith, but it is trust. But I'm suggesting a kind of rational trust. It's trusting God for good reasons, that he has reasons, even if I don't know what those reasons are. Now, there are a lot of other controversial things that Philip Goff affirms in the interview as well as the corresponding essay. While he identifies as a Christian, he clearly holds to some heterodox views. For example, he thinks that Jesus was raised from the dead, but not as a bodily resurrection, since his body sort of turned to energy or something like that, and that the post-resurrection appearances were merely visionary. He denies the virgin birth. He thinks that there are errors in Scripture. He doesn't think that Jesus' death on the cross was for sins so much as to bring God and creatures together in unity. It should be clear that Philip Goff is pretty far afield of orthodoxy and even a kind of biblical account taken at face value. And I think there's a lot of criticisms here for these sorts of views. For one, I'm not at all sure why he thinks that a visionary view of the resurrection is better than a bodily view. He says in his essay, if Jesus rose as a physical body that could be seen and touched, then surely he could have revealed himself to millions, making the existence of God and the truth of Christianity an indisputable historical fact. Now, I'm just honestly not sure why a bodily resurrection should mean that Jesus could have revealed himself to millions. And I'm at a complete loss to understand why the non-bodily resurrection and visionary appearances actually addresses this concern. I mean, if Jesus was handing out visions, and it seems he could have broadcast these visions to literally everyone on the planet all at the same time. But all of this speaks to how different Goff's view is compared to a traditional Orthodox Christian view. Okay, so is Philip Goff a Christian? Now, I'm taking this as a terminological question. We're asking, does the term Christian apply to Philip Goff or someone of his persuasion? I just think it depends on how we're using the term. When someone says that Goff is not a Christian, they seem to mean something like he doesn't hold to what they see as the minimal commitments in their preferred version of Christianity. But this will be different depending on the person. I've heard young earth creationists say that one is not a Christian unless one thinks that God created no more than 6,000 to 10,000 years ago over a 6 literal 24-hour day period. Or some are a bit more permissive and require something like agreement with orthodoxy or the ecumenical creeds of the early church. Now, it's clear that Goff has come to affirm some Christian views. He goes to church, I think he goes to an Anglican church, and he's expressed faith in Christ. The problem with calling Goff a Christian, I think, is an issue of clarity and potential confusion. If one were to say that Philip Goff is now a Christian without qualification, it certainly wouldn't be clear that he actually denies many of the historic claims of Christianity. For example, if I said that Richard Dawkins has recently identified as a Christian, would that be true? Well, in a sense, it's true.
I call myself a cultural Christian.
So it's technically accurate, but not very helpful. He is identifying as a cultural Christian, but he's still about 1 million miles away from actually believing in historic Christianity. To say that Goff has become a Christian without qualification is, I think, likewise unhelpful. But I think we just need to make clear that he's not become a Christian in the traditional sense of the term. And you know who's been really clear about this? Is Philip Goff. Most people get pretty offended by being labeled a heretic. It's not exactly the label that most people want, but Philip Goff has been clearly labeling his view as a heretical view of Christianity. I don't get the sense that he's even trying to be on team orthodoxy. He's been really, really clear about how different his view is, and he doesn't seem to have any worry that people will just very much disagree with his view. Many Christians see penal substitution as a crucially important doctrine. Here's what Goff had to say about it.
I very much respect philosophers who defend penal substitution, like William Lane Craig, for example. But for me personally, I do find penal substitution one of the most implausible claims ever defended in all of philosophy and theology. So if being a Christian means accepting penal substitution, I'm not a Christian.
So I think the way forward is just to be more specific and have greater clarity. Saying he's a Christian, while technically correct in a very broad sense of the term, doesn't really make clear the version of Christianity that he holds to and how different it is from historic orthodoxy. But I, for one, am glad he's on the journey. He might be 1 million miles away from orthodoxy, but at least it's raising lots of interesting questions, and these are all certainly worth our time and attention. Hey, I want to let you know about a movie project that I and a number of others have gotten to be a part of. The movie is called Universe Designed, and it comes from filmmaker Michael Ray Lewis. So Michael was a professional filmmaker. He still is a professional filmmaker. but his life was radically transformed by the gospel. And so over the last few years, he's raised support and produced this movie, and it's in its final stretch. It's almost there. So do go check it out on the website. There's a couple of movie trailers. Definitely check out his testimony in coming to Christianity. Michael was kind enough to help me set up my podcast here with the visuals and the lighting and so on. He really is the real deal. So do check it out and consider supporting the effort there.